So, welcome everybody to today's expert talk. And today we have the great pleasure to welcome Tom Morgan to our about 1 hour conversation. And Tom, he has been coined the most fascinating, most interesting man in finance by some people. He was something like the director of curiosity at Sapient Capital. I think officially it was director of communication, but probably director of curiosity would have been a more fitting title. And he's also a prolific author, currently still, I think, on Substack, moving soon to Ghost, writing great articles that we are big fans of at Evolute. And now he is also the founder and director of Leading Edge, as you can see also in the background. And we will talk about that as well, of course, and your transition phase that you are maybe in, or what you're up to now. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you for having me, guys. Excited to be here.
Welcome. Yeah. And so who are we? Like Dimi and me, we are the co-founders of Evolute Institute. We are in the business of inner development, and we create spaces for deep inner work with psychoactive modalities. So among other things, we support psychedelic-assisted inner work in the legal and safe and professional settings, breath work, and darkness retreats. So all kinds of modalities that help people to come into touch with themselves at a very profound level. And we have a great resonance with what, Tom, you're writing about and talking about. And so we thought it would be great to have this conversation. So let's give it a go. The first thing I want to talk about is your famous video that went viral after your conference talk at Sun or Zone conference. And in this, you talked about the most offensively taboo idea in Western civilization. And so let's maybe start with that. What is that most offensively taboo idea in Western civilization?
I feel like I was only half joking with that title, but I had 5 minutes in front of the world's most left-brained audience. So I was like, okay, I've got to get people's attention. And the most offensively taboo idea in Western civilization, in my opinion, although the YouTube comment section has disagreed with me and trying to find more offensive ideas, which I knew would happen, is that there is an intelligent, benign force in our environment that guides our attention. I've focused on curiosity, but you can call it a million different things. In fact, this week, I encountered a concept called syntropy. And in 1942, there was an Italian mathematician called Pantape, I think. And he argued that there was a symmetrical force to entropy called syntropy that pulled using attractors from the future into a state of greater wholeness, coherence, and complexity. And I've seen the same idea from the legendary systems theorist Ervin Laszlo, but it comes across all these different mystical and spiritual traditions. And what was interesting about the syntropy argument is it meshed with a lot of my intuition that we experience this attractor somatically through our heart center, which is why it's the source of all the idioms about heart being guidance and source of truth. But also, like, that's why I feel that the right hemisphere, which is connected to the heart much more than the left hemisphere, which is somatic and emotional and nonverbal, it directs us using those kinds of sensation. And that for me is like an incredibly powerful idea, because our hyper-rational imbalance towards our brain's left hemisphere poo-poos this idea, particularly when we start to get these little hints of curiosity that are actually potentially very beneficial and even intelligent signposts. Does that make sense?
Yes. Wow. You threw in like a lot of interesting ideas and concepts. I see Ian McGilchrist here, left hemisphere, right hemisphere, complexity science, like the holotropic attractor. So an attractor towards wholeness or more complexity, right? And now even syntropy. And the heart as kind of our sense organ for syntropy, maybe. So I think that's already quite a bit to start with. How did you come to this idea? Kind of, it's not that probably most people are living in a kind of state where they're mostly following their right hemispheric or heart intuition, right? Or is it? And how did you get to that realization that this might be missing somehow culturally or in some sense? Or is it not missing? I don't know. What would you?
It was direct personal experience of phenomena I couldn't explain, followed by what is now 7 years of obsessive research. The short, pathetic story is 15 years in finance on Wall Street. And then the last 2 years, I found myself in a very stale environment with a lot of very unhappy, stagnant, mostly men in midlife that had been told there was no capacity for personal reinvention. My body and brain started to break down. So I did an elimination diet that increased, I think, the voice of my unconscious, let's say. And long story short, one day I had a spontaneous spiritual awakening or psychotic break, depending on your biases. And I experienced a state of utterly indescribable transcendent love as the foundation of everything. I was suddenly like, oh my God, I know what God is. And I know what the Tao is. And it's the same thing. And my senses exploded open. I could see energy flicking off the trees. I became precognitive. Whenever I said anything that was untrue, my heart physically hurt. Whenever anyone came within 12 feet of me, I could sense their emotional state. All things that if you'd asked me the day before, if these were possible, I would have looked at you like you were a crazy person. And then on that day, I was acting like that crazy person. And then there were a series of absolutely insane synchronicities that helped me believe that what I was experiencing was true. Then I had 2 years of dark night of the soul, which was characterized by an inability to orient myself in the world due to being held totally energetically abstracted from it for whatever reason. And then once I came back into the world in 2020, 3 years later, I started to gain a heartfelt sense for truth. It's when I first encountered McGilchrist's work, and I've slowly cultivated that sense of curiosity. And I've increasingly tried to base my life around respecting that sense. And indeed, we can talk about it later, but I've just formed a business based entirely around this concept and with the naive assumption that it is correct.
Wow. That's crazy. I mean, as to most people, this sounds like a completely absurd situation. You're suddenly being struck by lightning, more or less, and experiencing pure transcendence and perceiving dimensions or layers of reality of your life that you have been completely ignorant to before. And so I'm asking myself, so having worked most of your life in finance and then having such an experience must have been very destabilizing or shocking, no? So how did you cope with that insight, and how even were you able to navigate in that environment, which you before called to be like incredibly left-brainy and probably denying everything that can't be put down in numbers or explained by statistics or some linear cause and effect?
It's a great question. I am an incredibly helpful guide for other people because I don't think I could have done more things wrong. Like if you made a checklist of how to screw up a spiritual awakening, I honestly think I got every single item on the list. So like a couple of days later, I went through like the messianic stage of, like I am Jesus. For 2 months, I became utterly insufferably spiritual and was buying Buddha statues and wearing beads and going to yoga classes. I think, one of the reasons why I started my company, The Leading Edge, is that there was no container that wasn't either grandiose or pathologizing. I ended up in the offices of their head of psychiatry at Columbia University, and I'm sure he meant well, but he basically said, there's no God. It's just electrodes in your brain. And you're sick and you're not getting better. And this is symptom management now pretty much for the rest of your life, which I was told by the entire mental health care system, which was, when your brain is so plastic, that was a catastrophically negative message for me. It nearly killed me. And then on the other side, you have these kind of relatively ineffective spiritual types. They're like, oh, congratulations, you're at stage 1. And I'm like, well, what do I do? And they're like, well, meditate some more. And then a lot of the people I met were like, absolutely don't meditate right now. Like, that's incredibly dangerous. And, the first book I read on the night of my awakening was Adyashanti's The End of Your World, which basically just says your world's over. You're going to go be a hyper spiritual person. Everything you thought was true. My wife read it and started crying immediately because she was like, well, I guess our nice life in Manhattan is over. And yeah, it did take us years to integrate this experience, but like, our lives are the same. Like, my job is different. I'm dramatically happier than I've ever been in my life, but like everything went wrong. My wife stayed with me more out of duty than love. Well, I guess they were the same thing. The only reason I didn't get institutionalized was because I had resources. But I did end up getting heavily medicated because I became delusional. And I think the last thing I'll say is that one of the overriding features of this entire episode was, in that first day, I gained a download of information that I'm still writing about now, probably pretty repetitive. I feel like I got all of the insights that I work with in like a 3-hour period, but my ego co-opted them out of pure terror. That basically these ideas were coming through into a brain that had no scope and capacity and framework and lineage, nothing to contextualize these ideas. So, for example, one night, I dreamt symbolically for the first time in my life. I guess that doesn't, I mean, you always dream symbolically, but I dreamt in these huge archetypal symbols. And one of them was this glowing ring, which is very Jungian. But my only framework for that was the movie The Ring. So I was like, oh, I've seen The Ring, I'm going to die in 7 days. So I was telling everyone like, oh, I've seen The Ring, I'm going to die in 7 days. And even though it felt differently in my body from the other convictions I had, but almost all have proven correct, like as precognitive as they were, I was still convinced and terrified for a week that I was going to die. So like, your ego is constantly trying to make sense of these things. And one of the better pieces of advice I was given was, don't talk to anyone about this. Don't write about it for 4 or 5 years. It takes 4 or 5 years for these things to bed in. Of course, it took me like 10 days to ignore that piece of advice. But like, the ego's willingness to recapture this experience was nearly fatal for me in a lot of different ways.
Okay, yeah, I would have thought about the Lord of the Rings and that I will get the ring to rule them all, which would have been a different interpretation. But I see that also the ring seems to have made it into the logo of your current venture. So there's something to this ring-shaped form. Okay, so it was, as you said, like probably a dark night of the soul, like a longer period where you were really struggling and you had no orientation, as you said, no lineage, no frameworks, and no community to guide you or help you, support you properly. And so that doesn't sound too appealing. So not something that you would recommend people to go through, right? Because you went through it, probably you can be a great Sherpa now because you have seen the dark places and you can help people make developmental steps without the crisis. But it's still like the question. So what are the ways to, as you would say, kind of waking up or having such experiences? Does it have to be a crisis, or are there other ways? And how would you talk about that? Think about that.
I'd like to make it abundantly clear that I have no idea. I have opinions,
yeah,
but a lot of it's based on, it's wildly anecdotal. I'll say some strange things first. This sounds more grandiose than it means to be, which is I think I had a shamanic call. That basically I was in an environment. So there's a pattern to shamanic illnesses, which is basically you see an affliction in your tribe, you get given the affliction, and then you get given the ability to heal that affliction because you have healed yourself. And whilst I feel like I did not heal myself, I feel like some sort of transpersonal force did. And the affliction that I saw was midlife crisis of getting yourself stuck professionally. Effectively, it's quite a narrow ailment, or maybe it isn't. I don't know. I got given the worst possible version of that. I screwed everything up, and now I help other people do that. But I think my experience of it was very, very, very extreme. And occasionally I meet people in very extreme initiation processes, which for me feel more like a shamanic initiation than a midlife crisis, which isn't to diminish the midlife crisis, because I think the midlife crisis is often a necessary maturational stage. I see the midlife crisis mostly as people going from narrow, egoically left hemisphere led to being led by the intelligent and benign attractors on the right hemisphere. But the left hemisphere is fundamentally competitive, and that process can be agonizing for reasons I don't fully understand, mostly because I think it decimates your entire worldview and requires you to surrender and sacrifice an enormous amount of things that you may have held true. I have started what I've started out of a place of uncertainty, which is that I think the thing I want to reduce in the hero's journey, you have the call to adventure, the refusal of the call, and then the crisis. So I had this sense that things were wrong, that then became aggressively embodied, the crises, right? My unconscious was calling to me. Like C.S. Lewis has this great line, which is, God whispers in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, and shouts in our pains. And my unconscious was shouting in my pains, and I was ignoring it. And so my goal with what I'm doing is to give people incrementally more confidence that that curiosity is coming with intelligence and basis. And just because it's non-verbal and non-logical does not mean it's not intelligent. So that's my window. But like, if someone's in the dark night of the soul, I'm not confident that I can help them. I can hold a hand, but that process is its own process, and I don't think I can interfere with that. I don't know. I'm gonna try and help, but I don't know how.
Yeah, no, that speaks to me, and I also see kind of the value of encouraging people to follow their curiosity, because as you say, if I live my life in a way that is not aligned with the system, and you could say not aligned with longer term considerations, in a way that is not life enhancing in some ways or so on. So if I'm straying away from a certain path, then I might experience the crisis. And it gets more and more intense. And the more I resist it and refuse to hear the call, the deeper the crisis gets. But if I am guided, you also mentioned the word initiated. If I'm guided properly, it can maybe be more, I don't want to say subtle, but more less painful. And one way to do it is to help people see that they might be like in the hall of mirrors of the left hemisphere in some ways, right? And orient towards what you say, what the heart says, or what curiosity leads me to, if I make space, if I quiet down, if I slow down, and if I start listening really. Because if I'm so busy running around and being anxious or so in my day-to-day life, then I can't listen to this more subtle calling. Maybe you even mentioned the word calling also, like something is maybe calling, or I follow like the resonance with something. And for this, I need to kind of let go of the left hemisphere dominance, because otherwise I would say this is unreasonable. You shouldn't do that. There's no money in this. So this is dangerous. So I need to really kind of make space for this. And I think we need more guides for this. So I'm.
Well, okay? So I'm doing this 8-part series right now, trying to synthesize all of the stuff that helped me, but also bringing in an expert for each episode, because I don't know it all. And these are all people that kind of have been involved in my community. But the next episode after this weekend is with a guy called River Kenner, who I found probably the freshest and most interesting voice online about, okay, McGilchrist has this right hemispheric theory. How do you become more right hemispheric? He's very practical and very cool. And it's all about like somatic work predominantly, and this concept of deep aliveness. And at the end of this series, something quite strange happened to me in lots of different ways. But one of the things was that a word dropped out of this series that I wasn't expecting, because I was reflecting. I was like, what did I get from this? And doing this exercise always changes me. This synthesis always changes me in some way. And the word was subtle. And I realized that every episode had this word subtle in it. And this may sound trivial to anyone listening or just so obvious, but I realized the reason why you clean up your diet or you meditate or you do breath work. I think a lot of people in my community are so performance focused. They're like doing the Wim Hof, right? Like they're taping their mouth shut. They're doing kind of almost acts of self-violence to improve performance. Whereas I understood it's lowering the volume because the right hemisphere is non-verbal, somatic, and occasionally very quietly verbal. It's spoken to me 2 or 3 times in my life, and it's a qualitatively different voice when I'm embodied or in like some radically embodied state. And so I was like, oh, you are connected to benign attractors. And the purpose of wisdom practices is not solely to make you feel good. It's to allow you to connect to intelligent guidance. And that for me was a revelation.
It's incredibly interesting because, of course, you say, well, if we're growing up in an environment where competitiveness and mostly unhealthy competitiveness is being rewarded, and to a certain degree, kind of having a narrow focus, a narrow interest to optimize on certain parameters, disregarding everything else. Of course, often the Western approach to spirituality becomes one of self-optimization, right? I'm going to the gym, I'm going to the therapy, I'm flossing my teeth, and I'm whatever, taking ayahuasca or meditating as part of my duty to become better. And it's paradoxical in the sense, right? Because we seek to maybe gain some deeper truth or transcend ourselves, but potentially end up only digging the hole deeper where we already are. And so you mentioned kind of the necessity sometimes to, instead of kind of piling up more and more things to do, maybe reduce your activity to reduce speed and to create more maybe emptiness, so that new things can come up and emerge, and that we can actually learn to listen. How can we practically do that?
I was just really interested that when COVID happened, everyone's demons kicked the doors in, right? Like The Body Keeps the Score. I think a 2014 book went to #1 in 2021 and stayed there all year, right? Like, that's weird.
Yes.
So I think it got forced on a lot of people. I think you have to, my expert for this episode is Anne-Laure Lecomte. She's a neuroscientist and curiosity expert. And she basically is like experiment, that you need to carve out a spot in your life that's probably proportional to the degree to which you're unhappy, to run exploratory experiments to facilitate your curiosity and do it kind of systematically. And I can speak more about like the specifics of structuring that, but that's one way. But, you know, like I started meditating with a Muse electrical headset because that's the kind of person that I am, or at least the kind of person that I was. And that was like, I think what I gave myself was an adverse meditation event where like I went from meditating never to meditating with like an EEG on. And again, my demons kicked the door in. And no one had even told me that was a possibility from meditation, because I'd listened to all this stuff like Sam Harris and 10% Happier that was like, this is going to make you a better stockbroker. It wasn't like, this is going to give you like Willoughby Britton. She's done some work. And I think in her research, she's shown that the average duration of a negative meditation event is 3 years.
Wow.
So like you get your space, but at what cost?
Yeah, I mean, so not every modality is for everyone, and people have been harmed by meditation and harmed by inappropriate use of psychedelic substances and many other modalities. I totally agree. And I think this is really something that is to be considered. Like for some people, like a very intense approach might be the right one. Having a very intense experience, like go fasting and into the wilderness alone for 4 days, which is probably a more extreme experience than others, like more subtle ones. Yeah, and for some people, it's really like a slower paced experience. And generally, there are different ways of approaching modalities that sometimes you could think it's just one modality. So for example, we facilitate psychedelic assisted retreats. So a retreat space is where you go out of your everyday life, so you can actually slow down. There's less noise. There's more nature. People are all there to introspect and to develop. So the context already is one that facilitates maybe moving to the more right hemispheric way of being. And then, for example, having the right preparation, then really great support, and then having integration can really create a very strong container for the psychedelic experience, so that then it's not destabilizing, for example, or re-traumatizing, or whatever it could be if it's done in different contexts without preparation, support, and integration. So, and then actually something that could, depending on the dosage and on the support, could be very strong and intense or extreme, can be very subtle and non-violent. So I think it's really like, it's an art in a way to create the right spaces or the right interventions for certain personality types, and depending on where they are on their journey. So
I thought about that. Like, I don't care about that aspect because I feel it's a solved problem that's been solved by other people than me. In fact, I see the opposite end of the spectrum, which is people going and having these peak experiences rather than necessarily the volume reducing experiences that are destabilizing. Their ego recaptures them and they have no integration process, typically because they're wealthy, because they're like, I don't need it, I'm now enlightened. So I formed my business as a
I lost the sound, Tom.
Yeah, me too. You are muted.
Doesn't look muted on Zoom, but there isn't.
Yeah, your sound, we can't hear you.
Just went off. It's just off.
Everything's the same on my.
Oh, you're back.
No, everything's the same on my end. Let me know if it goes anywhere. So I formed what I was doing right now as a way of holding people for the interim. That, like, where's the science? Where's the community? Where's the people that are going to call you on your bullshit? To basically like ground people, because actually most of these unintegrated experiences don't change people. But what I wanted to ask you guys about is one of the areas I am most curious about, which is incubation. Like, the background for me is that I encountered the work of this guy, Peter Kingsley, earlier this year, last year actually, read all of his books, which I never do. And he was talking about incubation as the basis of Western spirituality, which has been sort of totally ignored and co-opted because of the rise of Christianity. And everything, I mean, I can go on forever about how interesting he is, but like, I wanted to actually ask you guys about, like, why incubation? What have you found out about incubation? I'm a bit scared by the whole idea, but just tell me what you guys think.
But let me know what is how Peter Kingsley, what does he mean with incubation in his book?
His vision is it's the same as your darkness retreats. So basically, I believe he said that back in the day, you would go into a temple or a sacred place. You would lie in darkness for like 3 days. And then I think there'd be this hissing sound, which would be the sign that the transpersonal or the goddess Persephone or something was about to come and speak to you and deliver the message that you needed from the underworld. And that was the basis of a lot of spirituality in his world, perhaps because it brings you back to the unity that is the center of his worldview.
No, I mean, maybe Chris, should I start or?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. I mean, interestingly enough, Christopher and I, we just recently came back from our own darkness experience or incubation, and I think it's one of many modalities, right, that can help us bend kind of our telescope of perspective towards ourselves instead of always looking to the outside. And I think, first of all, darkness itself has some very strong archetypal meaning or weight that it's carrying, right? I mean, on the one hand, kind of darkness stands for total annihilation, for death, for the absence of light, for the end of things, for an infinity, kind of the most complete and total uncertainty, which is scary to many people. And then at the same time, darkness is kind of the origin of all things. We come from the womb, basically. We come from darkness and we dissipate into darkness at some point, right? And so I think just the concept of it is so fascinating. And when I first heard of, well, that darkness or incubations have been practiced for millennia, like for instance, the Tibetan Buddhists have done it as a part of the spiritual practice. I was immediately sure I would have to do it. It lasted, well, it took me quite some years to actually then make the decision to go there. But so for me, the dark is such a massive reduction of external stimuli that we are completely used to and that we take for granted, that at some point there is no other way than to look inside and then to suddenly observe your stream of thoughts, your emotions, your bodily sensations. There is just no other way to go. I mean, it's hard to imagine that with your eyes wide open, you just literally see nothing. And so hence, you see how your concept of reality is being constructed by your thoughts, by whatever comes up. And of course, for people who have experience in meditating and observing their thoughts and seeing them pass away, I think it helps us understand how we construct our own reality. And then, of course, as you said, Tom, we are kind of invited to listen more deeply. We are invited to attune to the subtle changes. And when there's nothing else to do, literally, than just to sit or lie in the dark or sleep, topics come bubbling up that have been pressed away or kind of shoved away, that were maybe too painful or we thought not important enough. And they start coming and coming with all their force until we acknowledge them and start being with this energy. And I guess that can be quite intense, but it's a beautiful experience. And again, I don't think I would recommend it to everyone. I guess it depends a lot on your journey, but it's definitely one of the modalities that is can be incredibly powerful. And Chris, you have your own.
Yeah. So this comes from the Tibetan tradition, where monks go into the caves and meditate for extended periods. So people are prepared by having already a very established meditation practice. And then they go into darkness for really very extended periods of time, up to 49 days. So 7 times. Yes, exactly. That was also my reaction. And there is a structure. They have a meditation cycle, right? Cycles like 7 times 7 days and so on. But we only did 5 nights, 4 days. So it's kind of for beginners, you could say, but it was surprisingly intense for me. In some ways more intense than a psychedelic experience. I don't know if people here saw the movie Triangle of Sadness. Yeah, and there's a scene where there's heavy seas and storm, and then everyone gets seasick, and then stuff comes up through the toilet system.
The plumbing breaks. Yeah.
System, and then it's swapping around. So it felt not in kind of with the smell and so on attached, but it felt like lots of stuff came up. Really, I was surprised by what came up, and in a way, intensity of what came up, of undigested experience, of unmetabolized experience still in my system. And I really went through in very detailed ways through my life, and good things, but mostly all the problematic things, you could say. Shame, guilt, fear, rejection, lots of rejection. And it was very a lot of processing happened there. There were some self-regulation techniques I applied, like exhaling very consciously and so on, to regulate a bit. But otherwise, it was also doing its own thing. And the thing is, it is very long. Again, Dimi said it's less condensed in time sense. It's very long, and this way it kind of it's a slow cooking, you could say. It's not like the quick heating. It's like slow cooked. No, 48 hours slowly cooked pork or so. And I mean, what is fascinating is that how much self-regulation happens through the eyes. So a lot of regulation happens through the eyes. And even if you're sitting in a meditation retreat in a group, even in a silent meditation retreats, you can still like open your eyes and look around and see, okay, the others are sitting there and they're also suffering and in pain, or so there is some regulation that can happen then through the eyes. And in the darkness, there's really not much that helps you. And the things you could do to distract yourself, like doing yoga the whole time or doing push-ups, of course, you shouldn't do it like to get away from your process. Yeah, so it's it's in a way very intense, even though you would think it's maybe not as intense as a psychedelic experience.
I would not think it was not intense. The
Okay.
idea of spending 4 days in darkness. There's a fantastic podcast, Third Eye Drops, with Eric Godsey, where he talks about the relationship of Jung, synchronicity, and incubation to each other. I'd recommend it. It's a phenomenal listen. But you made me think of something. In the 5th episode of my upcoming series, I interviewed a guy called Stephen Larson, who is Joseph Campbell's protege, effectively. And he's written some amazing books on shamanism. And at the end of the interview, after I turned off the tape, he was like, have you heard of Emanuel Swedenborg? Have you guys heard of Emanuel Swedenborg? No? Yeah, you're both shaking your heads, right? I've never heard of Emanuel Swedenborg. And he's like, oh, I think he's probably the finest visionary of all time. And I'm like, what? Like this guy, Stephen Larson, has been rubbing shoulders with giants like Stan Groff and Richard Tarnas and Joseph Campbell. And he's like, oh, this guy Swedenborg's the guy. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to read the shit out of this guy's books. And anyway, Swedenborg, I think, lived in Sweden in the 1700s. He wrote in Latin. So I didn't read primary text. I read a book called The Presence of Other Worlds. But it's really interesting because basically he completed knowledge, where in the 1700s, there was only so much science, and this dude read it all. He was some sort of intellectual, crazy savant powerhouse. And then by a certain point in his life, he was like, okay, I've completed the external world, so now I'm going to go to the internal world. And he inverts. And basically, due to the use of kind of breathing exercises, particularly the hypnagogic state, he turns inwards and starts mapping the inner world and comes out with this I don't know what the right word would be, but this kind of navigation of heaven and hell and angels and demons and God. And it meshes with a lot of the kind of the more esoteric Christian mysticism I've read. But the interesting kind of practicality is that he goes from being this clearly quite like elite and abstracted intellectual. And once he goes through this process of doing inner examination, he realizes none of the ideas are coming from him. So during this hypnagogic state in the morning, he realizes he's getting these auditory or symbolic like hallucinations basically downloaded into him, which is where all my writing comes from. It's not me. And he was like, oh shit, it's the same thing. So none of this is me, it's all God. It's all God just coming through me. And he became like a very humble person. And he wrote these massive books about this whole thing. And I can go on about this forever because it's like really interesting. But the reason why the link was, it was like, he was forced, well, he decided voluntarily to go inwards. But during incubation, it sounds like you guys are just like, well, I've got no other option but to go inside. So it kind of forces you. I don't know.
Yes. Yes, and what Dimi also alluded to, so it's very interesting, this relationship with darkness. So in the Tao, it says, seeing into darkness is clarity. And then knowing how to yield is strength. Use your own light and return to the source of light. This is called practicing eternity. So it is like you do meet your inner stuff, but what is actually the inner stuff? So if you're, I think if you're a bit experienced in meditation, then you have this experience that there's pure awareness and everything arises in awareness in a way. So my thoughts are arising in my awareness, as are my emotions, and I'm not identified with them, right? So that's one meditation state. And so you can stay at that level in a way, and this is something you cannot force, and it's more like experienced as an act of grace, that you drop into the non-dual state, so the unitive experience or unity experience, and where the dissolution completely happens between subject, object, or inside, outside. And then what is that then? So it connects very much to what you just shared, the experience that maybe those people had. And then they come back from this and they're not identified anymore with the content of their minds or their experience, right? So, because actually we don't know where the experience comes from. I mean, our ideas come from, right? It's like we claim them if we like them, and then we say like, so it's my idea, but do we know this? And I think it's what you're pointing to is if we let ourselves be guided by our curiosity and we open our heart, then it might lead us to very interesting places, and we might give up on certain old ideas about ourselves and our identity and so on. So.
And so picking up the thread about if we allowed ourselves, or we learned or experienced the grace, let's say, of being guided by some deeper inner wisdom, and maybe that inner wisdom is actually kind of the universal wisdom that we just finally need to realize. But how would you think that would change? That would change the world of society, right? Because also you are working with people who can be called kind of hyper agents, right? Who have a lot of financial means, they have clout, they have kind of a lot of disproportionate amount of influence over the world, over the systems we create. So how do you think that would influence our world in the most broader sense?
Yeah, I was thinking today, and I just tweeted it, that I'd rather have a left hemispheric person willing to work on themselves than a right hemispheric person trying to change the world, right? Like, I've been involved in both sides, where it's like you have these right hemispheric communities where no one has any executive function or skills or influence or connections. And they're like, we need to fix AI safety. And I'm like, do you know any of the 20 people involved in AI in Silicon Valley, like that can really make a difference? And they're like, no. I'm like, then what are you doing? Like, are you going to write blogs about this? Is anyone going to read them? Like, are you going to have long conversations using stupid words that you made up to describe this whole thing? It really annoys me. And then yet I see a lot of left hemispheric people. I'd say 80% of my community I'd put into like the strongly left hemispheric, but they're curious and they're willing to work on themselves. And, you know, the law of correspondences, or whatever you want to call it, you know, butterfly flapping its wings, whatever. I believe that when these guys work individually on themselves, it's likely to have a more positive cascading impact because they also huge leverage points, these people. And so I think that does make a difference. But to step back, the biggest question that I have is the universe intelligent enough to spontaneously restructure the economy, right? So when I talk about folly or bliss, seek this point of differentiation and integration, do what you love, yada, yada, most people's default response is, that's a privileged position, right? And I hate the word privilege because it's dehumanizing, but like, it's not wrong, right? Like if you're literally living subsistence, the idea of self-determination is ludicrous. Or is it? Or is it? Which is that if you are the fry cook at Taco Bell or an immigrant farmer in really dire circumstances, is that available to you as an option? You just don't think it's available to you as an option because you haven't been told it's an option. Now, overnight, there'd be catastrophic chaos, right? Because no one would do those essential worker jobs, or they'd all have to be repriced. Or, you know, like, does there have to be a certain amount of grunts in an economy all the time to keep it going, of just dissatisfied peasants, right? Like, or is God or the universe smart enough to be able to reconfigure this whole system and optimize it over once the chaos has subsided? I have no idea. But like, from a position of privilege, relatively, I guess, I decided to test this thesis in my own life, that my job at Sapient was the best job I've ever had by a factor of 50, and I really enjoyed it, but it started to get a little stale. I started to want to write about increasingly strange things, and there was no sense me doing that within a directly financial institution focused on wealth management. And so I was like, people have been coming to me for more than a year, probably 3 years, saying, can you build a container for people in these transitions where you curate content and practices? And I was like, yeah, I could, but my position right now is super mega crazy comfortable. And then when my position got incrementally more uncomfortable, I left and I zeroed out my salary. And I was like, I have no idea if this is going to work or if people will pay for it. And 4 weeks in, my God, they have. It's been a huge success. You know, not necessarily financially, but in terms of the quality of people that showed up and the intention that they have within the community. So it works. So like, I needed to test it in my own life.
Wonderful. So now you already told us what leading edge is, and so if I understood this correctly, so it's a community or more container for transition phases where you curate a certain program also for everyone who's part of this network. Is that right, or how would you phrase it?
Sort of. There's a lot of ways of looking at it. One, the basic is it's a group of 150 people, capped at 150. We're currently 80, and I might just close it because the first 80 is so good. I don't want to screw up the chemistry by introducing one more on by accident. The reason 150, Dunbar's number, everyone gets to know each other. It's a proper community. And then the idea is that the container is filled with other curious people, the best content I can find, and the best practitioners of healing, coaching, whatever it happens to be, that just are incrementally more reliable than Googling it. People don't have to be in transition. That's just my genre. So people kind of are, but they're curious and they're wondering what's next for sort of the next chapter of life. There isn't a program. I'm doing a series of the stuff that I found most interesting, which has experiments attached to it to make it less abstract. But I always told myself that philosophically, I would never sell a course. But also, if it's the Morgan method, it starts to become a cult, right? That like it's obvious there's no defined route, and I'm very suspicious of people that tell me that there is. What there can be is a container. That container is filled with love, and that container is like a good restaurant where people can go in and try good things made of good ingredients and speak to nice people, but find their own path, find their own point of differentiation and integration, which is by definition unique. Maybe there's a series of exercises I can take people through sequentially that will help, and my series is kind of doing that, but that's not the intent. The value is the container itself, which is why I had to charge for it, because I wanted to prove that people can value containers.
Okay, yes, very nice. Because I had a question for you, and I wanted, before you just now spoke, I wanted to challenge you, because you said like in the core question that the leading edge asks, questions that the leading edge asks are, where are our maps of reality incomplete? What needs to be added? And how will we act differently as a result? And I thought, but that sounds like a left hemispheric approach. You want to work on the map, right? And isn't the real magic in the territory, right? And if you want to approach the territory, you have to engage in practices. You have to do something. As you know, you love Reiki, so the ecology of practices, different things that appeal to different parts or layers in us, and where we are in a community and do embodied stuff also, right? And really practical stuff, and that there is the magic. So it's like that this kind of change that the questions point to, that it comes through more right hemispheric modalities. And not so much through a left hemispheric approach. But now that you spoke, you said like, yeah, maybe I will kind of do exercises and so on. So how would you respond to my question about, is it left hemispheric? We talk about the map all the time. We need to update the map or change the map.
The Gilchrist cadence is right, left, right. Information comes in from the right. If it conflicts with your map, it causes cognitive dissonance. Eventually that dissonance breaks, you incorporate the anomaly, and then you test that new map against the world to see if it's better. It's an upward spiral where basically all wisdom is, in my opinion, is how efficiently are you navigating the world, right? Like what is the difference between how you see the world and how you live in the world? Like we can talk about map and territory all day long, but like if you need to go and get a sandwich for lunch, you need to know where the sandwich store is. This is about executive function. And I think a lot of spiritual traditions ignore the practicalities of executive function. And so like you need the left hemisphere very much in this model, but I could not agree more with your objection that basically every episode in this series is like, all right, what are we wrong about? What's missing from that picture? Now what are we going to do about it? And that third part is what you're talking about, which is like, I'm interested in a lot of woo topics, but I'm not going to touch them if there's no so what, right? Like my wife is constantly like, is any of this shit, excuse me, making you a better husband or making you a better father? No, right? Like then why you care? Like UFOs, interesting topic. Is it changing how you act in the world at all? Probably not for most people, right? Goes in the interesting but not me pile. So it's like, I don't know. The next week we're covering practices specifically with River, and it's like, okay, what are we missing? We're taking practices out of context. We're saying, I'm going to meditate, I'm going to do breath work to make me more productive, but I'm going to take it out of lineage and it's going to be dangerous. So what you actually need, what I'm literally writing next week is about Viveki in my interview, where he's like, you need an ecology and a community within that ecology is based. It needs to be a dynamic series of intrinsically enjoyable and beneficial practices that balances each other out in a community that holds you accountable. It's very left hemispheric to be like, how can I meditate to make myself more right hemispheric, right? There's a fundamental tension there. But like, it's like the end of that episode is like, here is a somatic practice. You can try it for 2 weeks. If you enjoy it, see what happens. If you don't, so what? There has to be a degree of experimentation. It's getting that experimentation balanced with not being a dilettante, right? And being like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. You need people keeping you accountable within the community.
Yes, because I would have said, so what is the leading edge actually? Leading edge is when you come to the limits of your ability to perceive or to relate to attune to. Then what you need is not to turn away from that, right? And go back into safety and to what you know, which would be the turning back and going the left hemisphere way to the established maps. But I actually need to open up more at the leading edge and be comfortable with the uncertainty there. And this is like following the curiosity, right? Or the calling or following a resonance or so on, and having the courage then to stay there in this zone of discomfort, maybe at the leading edge. And then maybe the practices you mentioned, like when we try them out, we make new emotional reference experiences, new relational reference experiences, and so on. And this transforms us. And so then it's, and this is like a fully embodied affair, and it's a marriage of left and right hemisphere. As you said, it's not either or, it's like the right balance between it, right? And there the magic really happens. So I love your idea and the project.
Well, but there's also a play on words here, that it is edge, right? Like, as much as I don't want this to be a productivity hack, there's a huge amount of paranoia in my circles right now about artificial intelligence on a deeply practical level, which is this going to take my job? Because it probably is for a lot of these very left hemispheric professions. So I'd be talking to a lot of investment banks and doing talks for them where it's like, okay, what are you doing for human edge, right? Human edge is enduring. There are areas of intuition, there are areas of perception of attractors, which are fundamentally not, like AI is not connected to attractors. That for me is the most interesting idea ever, that you can go as deep as you want to. But what's super interesting to me is that like the sell side that writes investment research, in my experience, apart from a couple of innovative people I've spoken to, won't touch this. They won't touch it because all aspects, well, no, a lot of aspects of increasing human edge are the topics that we're talking about today that get dismissed because they're woo. And I'm like, fantastic, right? This is giving me white space for as long as people want to ignore it, right? Like all these people are going to get edge, but you know what? They might also get happier and wiser and more settled in their lives as well, because they get hemispherically rebalanced. But they're also going to maintain like literal professional edge. Like it's human edge here. And they'll also be at the edge of the debate. Like my friend Ali Biner from Rebel Wisdom has always talked about this thing, the novelty famine, where it's like, there's nothing new out there. Everyone's just recycling the same shitty analyses of like, galaxy brain problems around the meta crisis. And I'm like, no one's coming up with practices and no one's coming up with optimistic solutions. So I was like, brilliant, I'm going to do that as well. There's so much white space here. And, why I like talking to people like you guys is that like, there's a network of networks idea here as well. There's a lot of these communities that I would have to be harsh. Most of them are ineffectual and have ineffective people in them with low executive function. My community is unusual, in my opinion, actually unique, but I don't know what I don't know. In terms of it is left hemispheric predominant people, like rich and powerful people, that are all really interested in the right hemisphere. They're a great balance, and I'd rather that they're coming from that direction. And I want everyone to form these communities and then start sharing resources between them. you can't scale the communities. You shouldn't scale the communities, but you can scale everything else around them scalable, in my opinion.
Yes, no, I think I resonate, or probably we can speak also for Dimi, resonate a lot with this idea. We want impact and not just have great conversations and theories, but so to think about this, which spaces to create that actually the right people can learn more about themselves and the world and maybe shift something in their worldview. And then it's like from the inside out, as you said, like from each person's inner process, something new emerges because then they relate differently to the world they're already in. And so I think this is the way to go, and everyone starts where he or she can, I mean, in their existing networks. And then if we have privilege, as you said, then we might as well make use of it, right? I mean, there are different ways of talking about privilege. Like one that I like a lot is like privilege is what you can afford to turn away from. And so this is, I like a lot because it's like, it's true. Like everything I don't have to be exposed to, I'm privileged in that, right? So, and in this way, it's not bad. You don't have to feel bad. It makes you more like realize your own responsibility, your ability to respond, to do what you feel is right or best in wherever you are right now. So not like fantasize about systems change, as you say, like there's so many people fantasizing about systems change, but where's the system? The system is here in each of us, in our relations. That's the system. There's no abstract system. And it's not that we have to get somewhere to do something. We have to become more present. And through our inner processes and change in relationality, in relations, then I think things can move. And then we see if it's enough. You mentioned before, and you wrote about it, the apocalypse. Is it necessary? Will it come or not? Do we need to buy a bunker in New Zealand, like Peter Thiel? Or should we build modern wisdom centers? So adult development centers where actually people come together, and now maybe in cyberspace, like the way you do. And everyone has to look for themselves, like, will I become a prepper? Or do I lean into my current networks of relationality? And so I don't know what
I think about the expression, if the world was going to end tomorrow, I'd plant a tree today. And you know, to reflect on, I totally like resonate with that quote. For me, wealth is the ability to pursue what you love and ignore what you don't, right? And I feel that if the apocalypse is coming, which is not my baseline, but if the apocalypse is coming, what do? Well, you focus on individual consciousness, right? I feel that like every time we try and reinvent a systemically improved world, we'll end up in Pol Pot's Cambodia or Jonestown. We don't have the intelligence. We have the intelligence to create a market system, and my God, it's been fantastic. But the market system actually just incorporates all human shadow into it as well. It's why so like, you know, the US system is based on collective intelligence, but also collective shadow. And if we can invert that model in service of whatever the attractor's intelligence is, which is sort of that breakdown of the model that I'm talking about, like, is the attractor intelligent enough to reconfigure the modern economy? That's a question, right? Like, that's a question. And maybe that averts apocalypse. Maybe, probably doesn't.
Yeah, well, the economy is, again, like all the interactions of, I mean, mostly alive entities, and they create the economy. So in the end, like when many people change the way they behave, they orient themselves in the world, the way they relate, I think the economy will change with it. Is it happening like fast enough, the right way? Is it through guidance from an attractor, or I don't know, through organismic processes that we can't fully comprehend that emerge out of the interactions? I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I'm very much aligned with this idea that you change the world one leader at a time, in a way, one hyper agent at a time, or one person at a time, and it goes through our internal processes. And that's why I love your new venture so much. And I think it's very much aligned with what we are working on. So
thank you.
Yeah, anything we left out that you feel like, I still want to speak to that? So that is something that is on my heart. like to?
No, I guess I'd say to anyone listening, if you know a practitioner that's world-class, particularly one that is not being recognized for their value, if there's something you've read that's been transformational, if you want to be involved, let me know. I'm probably not going to take new members for a while, but like, let me know. Like, if your community is doing something really innovative that you think is a source of collaboration, let me know. Like, you know, you guys have always been really interested in the darkness and the incubation, and I learned a lot from this conversation about that. And it's about this reciprocal opening between all of these communities that, to my mind, it hasn't happened enough yet, where everyone has their own individual initiatives and they don't share. So I know you're probably connected to a lot of these different initiatives, and to the extent that what they have is scalable, let's scale it. But my area of focus is, I don't need a white paper on climate change, right? My area of focus is what's going to work for someone of means, and why, and what can we try, and what can we experiment with in a responsible way.
And how can people get in touch if they want to get in touch? Is there...
I never turn down a meeting, which is a dangerous thing to say. I'm on Twitter at Tom Owen Morgan and theleadingedge.org.
That's wonderful. And we'll share that also in the resources under the expert interview, of course.
Thank you.
Dimi, anything from your side? Anything that emerged for you from the conversation also?
A lot of things emerged, but I think nothing that I would like open up now at the end.
Okay,
but it was a pleasure having you, Tom. So thanks a lot for your brilliant ideas. Was lovely.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And let's explore this leading edge together. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye.